welcome to today's panel. We have Escalating Privacy's Privilege using design thinking to identify what matters. We have three panelists with us today, and I'm the moderator, Josh Bucher, a research analyst for the Cloud Security Alliance. Starting with Jody, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jody Masters Gonzalez. I'm the principal researcher at Humble Science. My area of expertise is AI governance ethics from a human factors perspective. I'm really happy to be here today.
Steve, do you want to say?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Foster, currently a senior manager for product security, quality management systems, data privacy, and CSV, which stands for Computer Systems Validation. I'm currently at J&J Vision and certified data privacy solutions engineer.
Thank you. And Mike.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, I'm coming more from a security engineering background today, and it's something, privacy is something we see day in and day out. So for a lot of folks out there who currently work in the security field, I'm happy to share a little bit of insights on the research we're doing to tie security with privacy.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And jumping straight into our first question. So why are we working on privacy by design and default? Why is this important? Steve, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, privacy by design and default has been around a little while. It is a good way for us to think about how privacy needs to be integrated, from the design aspects of whatever systems or product you're designing or developing. It's important to think about its complexity when it's taken in totality, because you're really bringing together a number of different stakeholders that have expertise that are very related, but oftentimes not always connected. So in terms of regulations, technical aspects, data management aspects, we want to kind of bring together a group that can really kind of talk through different scenarios. And so the more we can work together, develop some of those team dynamics, I think it's an area of opportunity for us all.
Privacy and data protection, although very important, are not just about regulatory requirements. They are also crucial to maintain trust and reputation with your customers. So with the privacy by design and default approach, we're taking a little bit more proactive approach to privacy to align with what society expects from us.
And I'd also argue that privacy is largely untapped from an innovation standpoint. So why not proactively create positive sum solutions that prioritize it?
Awesome. And taking that one step further, what do we mean when we say escalate privacy's privilege? Steve.
Well, in the context of cybersecurity, escalation of privilege is often used to describe a particular type of threat. When it comes to privacy, we just want to make sure that privacy is up there. And a lot of times privacy does help drive requirements to help us align on what type of security controls are necessary. So we just want to make sure, especially in our field where we deal with healthcare, we're regulated by the FDA, and FDA is continuously publishing new requirements, guidelines, one-day regulations, and their jurisdiction is primarily on safety. But they don't necessarily cover privacy. So we're going to see more and more documentation associated with cybersecurity in general. But privacy also just needs to continue to maintain its prominence, and even from a technical and engineering perspective, we want to make sure we're designing systems with privacy and a seamless experience in mind.
I also think it's important to point out that escalating privacy's privilege means more than just agreeing with some legal obligation. It's a fundamental human right and should be treated with the same urgency and respect as safety.
Thank you, Mike. And do you want to elaborate a little bit more on the importance of escalating privacy's privilege?
Absolutely. So remember 15 years ago when we changed the security field by shifting left? Now imagine the same groundbreaking shift for privacy. Today, more than ever, we need to build privacy in from the get-go. Look, being proactive is more than just streamlining processes and saving costs or delivering higher quality software. It's also about a promise, a commitment to our customers. Think of it this way. Privacy is a twin soul of security. Together they craft an unbreakable bond of trust. So why treat privacy as the underprivileged one? Let's give it the priority it rightly deserves.
And a point of clarification here, when we say privacy, we are speaking of privacy from a respectful, user-centric point of view. However, we also mean privacy in a proactive and preventative sense as well, which requires increasing organizational learning in this area, incorporating privacy into culture, values, and the broader ethos.
Thank you, Jody. And so this panel that we're doing today is actually based on some of the research that we're doing as the currently DevSecOps working group. And later on, we're going to announce something related to that. But do we want to elaborate a little bit on what we're trying to accomplish with the research that we're doing this based off of, Jody?
Sure. So this phase of research is just one piece of a larger research project that Josh alluded to, and paper that we're naming at the time being Practical Implementation of Privacy by Design and Default in DevSecOps. And today, at this point in our research, we are reporting on the progress of this phase, specifically our approach to initializing a privacy by design and default implementation within a mock sort of organizational environment. So we are really excited to share our progress and a few findings.
And to add what Jody is saying, think of it as a sneak peek into the future of privacy protocols. So we've discovered keys to what makes an implementation click and where the pitfalls lie. But here's the golden nugget. We're distilling our journey into actionable insights for everyone who's venturing into privacy by design and default. How to do this? This isn't just our story. It's a blueprint for the next generation of privacy and DevSecOps.
Thank you, Mike. And so how can organizations get started and get stakeholder buy-in when they're trying to start one of these privacy by design and default feasibility studies? Steve, do you want to?
Sure. Well, the idea here is to be able to create an environment where you can kind of bring the different stakeholders together, the different competencies in the organizations together, recognizing that there's some value in what typically could be called a tabletop exercise, where everybody kind of explores a particular scenario that engages the topic in multiple facets. And so that's something that we were pursuing in this whole exercise, but it isn't something that necessarily has to cost a lot of money. It's something that could be, that can be brought in and proposed in the context of a few meetings, depending on how much time it takes. But, I think it should be low barrier of entry from a cost perspective. And it's just definitely something that can be done to really reduce the risk of scenarios and protect, investments and also reduce risk to brand identity. As we all know, data breaches get publicized, and it's not a good look for a company. So you want to do what you can up front to just see if you can, mitigate as much as possible.
And for frame of reference, for organizations who are new to this in terms of incorporating it into their ethos and their development life cycles with intention and proactivity, it took us about 12 months of sustained effort to arrive at this stage of research. So when we initially started, we came in and there were people who were interested, and we had a lot of looky-loos, but the requirement to learn and to stay and to get engaged, there is a runway to that. So while the cost, actual literal cost to entry is low, there is a little, just be aware that there is, we think, a runway, especially for organizations who are, trying to do this in their very early stages of adoption, that, could be, for us, it was about 12 months. So the goal and the aim is to get enough interest to form a research team to explore the best practices of implementing privacy by design and default. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of educating, informing, and learning from each other. There is a great deal of cross-functional learning that is and continues to occur.
So exploring that a little bit further, Jody, do you want to cover what design thinking is and why we decided to use that approach?
Sure. So design thinking is often used to create new and innovative solutions to very complex challenges. Design thinking is an integrated method where the solution space is emphasized rather than the problem, or focusing on just, what the challenges are. So the solution space is emphasized and it's prioritized over the problem space. And getting approval to initialize a privacy by design feasibility study proactively up front rather than reactively down the road can be very complex in and of itself, and extremely complex when attempted for the first time, as I mentioned previously. So the buy-in, the cross-functional buy-in is really important. So given the circumstances, design thinking seemed like a great fit from a methodological standpoint.
And going one step further off of that, so why did we choose scenario-based workshops to facilitate the design thinking exercises?
Well, what we know about adult learners is that they learn best when the discovery of new knowledge occurs through intuition and experience. So emphasizing the process of learning for adults is of the highest value. And when we learn what we do. So experience is the richest resource for adults. Lindemann, he was an early philosopher and expert in this area. He said, experience is life's textbook. So authoritative teaching precludes original thinking and is a killer of creative and innovative aims. So we knew this experience had to be hands-on and as close to real life as possible if we wanted to innovate in this space.
Thank you, Jody. And so what is nominal group technique, and why do we feel like it might have been a good idea to include that in the component of the scenario-based workshops? Mike?
Yes, well, Josh, like Jody emphasized, the value of learning, right, especially amongst adults, was something we saw when we hosted and facilitated some of these sessions, is that you might have one or two voices dominate or overshadow the entire conversation. For instance, it could be lawyers or some other groups, and they end up talking a lot about their perspective. Look, privacy is a cross-cutting concern. It really touches everybody. But when you go into the nuances of different silos or different roles and professions, you get very unique perspectives, and it can overshadow the holistic view of privacy and how it benefits the organization and the customer, more importantly. So enter nominal group theory. Nominal group theory really encourages us to write down ideas, not to voice them. And that enables equal participation. It's more inclusive. It allows more diverse thinking, diverse thought. Every voice is heard. That's the key here. We make everybody feel heard and understood using the nominal group technique. So why is it important for privacy by design and default? Well, as I mentioned, privacy impacts many, many professions, from engineering, customer service, marketing, sales, just to name a few. And by getting every voice on the table right there, we not only learn, but we also form a guiding coalition to prioritize the right problems and the right solutions for the customer and for the business.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And so moving on to why we decided to incorporate scenario-based modeling in the first place. Steve, do you want to kick us off there?
Well, I think a scenario is basically something that you can develop that can be more specifically applied to different types of business cases, different type of industries. So, in our case, in the healthcare context, we can define a fictitious business scenario whereby, due to a national pandemic, you get an international government grant to generate some sort of AI-based diagnostic tool to rapidly diagnose conditions related to this pandemic scenario. So by pulling off an unbounded constraint of funding, because if this is an international project, basically you kind of open up the freedom to apply any known technology, invest in any type of opportunity to comply with the one requirement in this case, which would be global privacy compliance. We want to make sure that all users of this emergency device are protected with respect to their particular condition and their information. By integrating that scenario, you have the opportunity to use AI-based technologies, emerging AI-based technologies. We were able to leverage some current research going on in that technology, whereby aggregated image data is used to help diagnose different types of conditions. How do you apply data minimization, data anonymization techniques, using that in a precision medicine context where you're actually looking at very customized specific scenarios for based on the customer's data or the patient's data, where you do need that data. You need that person to be able to use and be benefited by their own information. And then other aspects such as like integrating hospital EHR systems. That's a pretty normal thing to do these days, but all of that has to do with how you manage data, when data needs to be controlled, mitigated from a privacy perspective, and when it needs to be accessible. And so by creating this scenario where all of those things fit into a context of one fictitious business model, the teams can come together and look at things from the perspective of their backgrounds, but also share and exchange ideas so that actually everybody benefits and starts building a competency on the business problem. So hopefully that makes sense.
And to further what Steve said, from a research standpoint and how we know adults learn, a plausible real-life scenario where collaborative learning could take place, we knew would be ideal. So imagine for a moment the scenario that Steve has set up for us, and the number of people and teams within an organization, between organizations, around the world, and all of the different system dynamics that need to go into making this happen. The amount of integration that needs to occur from a knowledge and a collaboration standpoint is not only complex, but the scope is incredibly large. So what is happening here is not only learning how to incorporate these ideas and these principles, but what's also occurring is the slow adoption of sort of these values within the organizational ethos, where privacy becomes top of mind throughout the development cycle, hopefully. And it's one of the questions that we check ourselves. What's also learning from an adult learning standpoint is learning to learn with each other. Sometimes it requires bracketing that authoritative learning that we've all had to some degree or another. So if we have degrees, professional degrees, if we have certifications, those are like examples of authoritative learning. So what this allows us to do is to get into a sandbox where all of us who are professional, all of our years of experience, we need to sort of bracket that. And it's a safe place where we can learn and be vulnerable, make mistakes, do things that might sound stupid or dumb, but we know that that's not. We know that that's just part of the process of learning something new. So one of the many tools available, scenario-based design or modeling, is such a great approach to do all of that. And specifically, coming back to the scenario, looking at the problem space, which is the traditional sort of approach, but also this way of thinking about solutions from a human-centered point of view. And, we're allowing folks to develop a sense of empathy for the other stakeholders in the group. So when we cross-train, when we're vulnerable, we allow other people to be vulnerable, there is something that happens, which is this empathetic sort of development for each other, where we give each other a lot more grace and time. And it's really a critical dynamic that happens within this innovation, this creative process. So design thinking and other human-centered design approaches really allow us to get into that specific place in the group setting.
Another thing that comes to my mind also allows for having this, I guess I'd say, a company agnostic environment where you're not dealing with, the typical day-to-day things that can come up, and it's an opportunity to meet both cross-functionally, as Jody said, internationally, and there's all sorts of ways to engage the diversity that's out there when it comes to solving technical problems, regulatory problems, data management problems that all need to come together in a cohesive solution that's based on this business scenario. So there's a lot to be gained from just, allowing folks to come to a neutral environment to solve a focused problem that, hopefully brings out a lot of good qualities in everybody, but also, as Jody mentioned, an opportunity to learn from each other. We all on our own don't necessarily know it all. So we're definitely learning from each other, building a kind of a group community competency that will help us to kind of internalize and grapple with the technological changes that are around us every day.
And just to add to what Steve and Jody is saying here about learning from each other and building those bonds of empathy and understanding, threat modeling is becoming more commonplace in the world of security engineering. Like the 4 questions framework: what are we building? What can go wrong? What can we do about it? Did we do a good job? It made sense to adopt an approach that was more familiar. But it's not just about familiarity. It's also about harnessing a tried and true method for structured thinking. We give people some structure to think about privacy concerns, and that is the scenario-based modeling.
Thank you, Mike. And why did we keep the scope of this workshop very high level and centered around the business opportunities? I guess pass it back to you, Mike.
Absolutely. So what we faced is that, and what we saw is that often when we are presented with a business opportunity, there's a rush to develop products and services that maximize profit. But the priority and our focus should really be around adding value for customers, stakeholders, clients, partners. Revenue is a byproduct of building customer value. And so keeping our first workshop a little bit high level and focusing on a broader business perspectives help people to connect the dots. They could see how their different roles, their different perspectives contribute to adding value to the customer, but also to unearth and really to elucidate the privacy aspects of business and how the entire organization benefits when we actually put privacy in its rightful position where it should be and where it is deserved.
And I'll also just throw in that, when you deal with high complexity situations, you think of, maybe some of the classic, symbols like the pyramid, where at the high level, you have more of the narrow topics and aspects to get this group to coalesce around, to kind of establish roles, establish how they're going to fulfill some of these needs. But as the complexity expands and you build lower and lower levels of complexity in that pyramid, your coverage and your capacity actually starts to be more and more challenged. So you can identify where the group has certain gaps, where do we need to bring in some external support. So these are ways that you can kind of help with managing this complexity, because as we add all of these different elements of this fictitious business scenario, whatever group comes together and whatever group is growing through this process, we'll be able to identify some areas where even amongst the group, even no matter how large it is, there'll be some areas that are going to be new, that'll be not fully contained by the team that gets pulled together. So that's where we have to figure out, how do we bring the capability and competency in as each layer gets more and more expanded. So starting at the high level is a good way to at least establish things like governance, dynamics with the team, and getting some of that going so that you can really build in a lot of the good detail after you establish those primary objectives.
And we've ran this workshop 2 times now. And initially we were planning on doing a different type of workshop for the second run. So Jody, do you want to elaborate a little bit on why we decided to instead iterate on the first workshop?
Sure. So the original plan was to approach our path forward in a way that was scaffolded, as Steve was mentioning, thinking of this pyramid, starting with concepts that could be very new. It's an adjusted or flipped way of approaching or seeing the problem space, flipping it to the solution space. That might just take people a minute to really kind of not just be able to make the flip, but stay in that flipped state of really examining the solution. And as we came back together, we're really playing sort of 3 hats. The first one is, as researchers, where we're looking at this as objectively as possible. And then we're entering the research 4 questions, beginning with what are we building, and, how did things go? What could we do better? We had some initial feedback just amongst our group. And so some of us felt like, from a research perspective, I think a lot of people have heard, about the number of participants and the relationship to, well, how is it, valid if we don't have as many research participants? But after stepping back and really thinking about those comments, we realized within an organization who is trying to adopt these principles and then implement it within the design lifecycle, we're probably not going to have 50 people at the table, maybe 20-ish, give or take. So in that sense, the quantity of participants really wasn't as important as the diversity of participants. So do we have the right stakeholders at the table? And what we know and what we saw was that within the participants who showed up, they were primarily, I would say, security folks, maybe some engineers. So when we saw what was happening, a lot of the solution space was really focused on control, rather than this earlier phase of being high level and really understanding about connecting with the value, where value is generated for the organization. So greater diversity of participants. Then from a technical standpoint, going back to the nominal group technique, remember that was a technique that Mike really brought to the table from his experience running these threat modeling scenarios with his clients, where there's some dominant voices in the group. Just from a technical, like using how we set it up, which was a collaborative document, some felt that they were kind of protective of their spaces and either felt, people were entering and working in their spaces, or there was concern and just unnecessary stress generated during a creative process, which we want to minimize that as much as possible. So just from a technical standpoint, how do we use a shared document where we're eliminating and mitigating a lot of this? So for example, there was a concern that if 2 people might be in the same cell at the same time, and then that's lost, and then there's distraction. And just maybe more high level, what I've noticed is the need to just continue emphasizing to participants that whatever they share will be de-identified and aggregated and not shared with folks who didn't participate in the workshops. So, alluded to this earlier, it's a really new sandbox type of a space. And depending on the dynamics of the different organizations, people aren't used to coming out of their lane, so to speak. And we really, really wanted to encourage that. So hence we iterated the workshop, the first one, incorporating this feedback, and we ran it a second time.
Thank you, Jody. And moving on to the results that we had with the workshops. So what were some of the experiences that we heard from the participants, and what did they mention gaining from the experience, Mike?
Well, Josh, as Jody mentioned, we used the nominal group technique to encourage diverse thought. People appreciated learning from each other, gaining different perspectives from different roles and disciplines, broadening our thinking caps beyond traditional silos. Interestingly, attendees also described these sessions as refreshing and fun. They enjoyed it very much. It was actually, it didn't necessarily feel like work. It was really a fun experience, which raises an interesting question. Can such an approach to structured thinking also boost morale within your team?
And building off of what Mike has just shared, others from a scenario, the topic itself, felt the timing was good. So recalling that the topic of the scenario was generative AI health app deployed globally to diagnose emerging diseases. And within that, important to consider, learn about perspectives of technologists, vendors, everyone involved in this chain or this system of developing such an app, deploying, managing, etc., such an app. So the topic, the health topic, really landed well with our participants. And there were group discussions around organizational level data classification strategies versus data classification strategies at the project level. And maybe Steve can speak a little bit more about that. And another finding was some participants reported needing more time to reflect on the scenario before responding. So I just also want to emphasize, I think sometimes when we run research, we fall in the trap of wanting to confirm our assumptions or, our research question. But one thing when you learn to go through the training as, a researcher from an academic standpoint is even null hypotheses, which means you prove the opposite of what you thought, is also really, really important. So because we ran this scenario in through a volunteer organization, the Cloud Security Alliance, a really amazing organization, all of our participants, including ourselves, we are volunteers. We don't have that much time. So it really highlighted other elements that when organizations attempt to do this, if they attempt to do this approach, they will hopefully have a longer runway and more time to run these workshops. We only had about an hour. So that was, I think, really important. Some folks need time to reflect, to process before they can start generating ideas.
And on the topic of generating ideas, what were some of the common themes or overlapping ideas that we saw? Were there any contrasting ideas that we saw? Mike?
Yes, Josh. I think it's also important to acknowledge the diversity, right, of participants we had. So what we saw is that there was a slant, or there's a trend to look at the privacy concerns more from a technical and more from a security technical perspective, which is not surprising, right? Being at the Cloud Security Alliance. So most participants mentioned data storage, anonymization of data as a privacy concern. We also saw a strong emphasis on regulations, possibly boosted by us mentioning in the scenario of the need to comply with regulation and compliance. The areas we did not get much attention on would be fairness and transparency. How does this algorithm work? Diversity of training data. Is there potential biases that might occur because we didn't train it diversely enough? And then user consent, ensuring customer rights and autonomy over their personal data. So that's more or less the common themes that we saw, and then the areas where we see not so much emphasis was gained during these exercises on those ones.
And going off of that, breaking the ideas down, what percentage of them were centered around the customer and client business needs versus product needs, technical engineering needs?
Interestingly, the ideas could all be tied to a business threat or need in some way or form. But interestingly, participants did emphasize facts that have a very strong material impact to the business. Things like intellectual property, resource management, not wasting the public resources like grants, customer trust, not hurting the trust people have in the product by allowing some breach to occur, regulation and compliance, and the efficiency of operations. So even though on first glance it might seem like a lot of these findings are a little bit more lower level, interestingly, a lot of it we could tie it back to the business landscape, and that just again emphasizes the value of looking at this problem in the first workshop a little bit more holistically, to allow every voice to be heard and to help people to connect the dots on how this might add value to the customer at the end of the day.
Steve, did you want to?
Well, I guess, in terms of what I saw, I agree with a lot of the comments Mike made. Generally, what we need to do is we need to pull people together and highlight and possibly categorize some of their group thinking so that we can take a thread and carry it through into some sort of implementation effort. A lot of these strands are coming from a lot of different walks and careers. We're trying to centralize it into a key objective in the business. So I think that's just what we're trying to do is kind of expedite that formation process, that integration process, and bring some of the core engineering competencies to apply their talents in the context of some very, high level principles of privacy. So I think that's something where, we'll kind of take that away and, see what we continue to drive going forward.
Just to emphasize what Steve is saying there as well, very often we do have the skills and expertise in the organization to do this. There is, however, an opportunity to nudge people in solving the right problem, broadening their horizons to see the bigger picture, and that's what we are doing here with this research, right? Is to guide people and to help people to implement privacy by design and default.
Thank you, Mike. And we only have a couple minutes left, so we'll wrap it up with this last question. What matters most when we're escalating privacy's privilege, and keeping this in the context of the concepts that we've discussed so far? Steve, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I think it's about putting context behind the technical talent and the regulatory talent, the legal talent that has to come together and come up with a cohesive solution to to meet the needs for the user and to protect the rights of the user. So really, you need that collaboration between technical and non-technical, but then the content itself has to be managed. So you have the data management, you have the data science professionals that might be integrating solutions just to manage the machine learning algorithm in the case of an AI technology tool. So the diversity of technical capability, of professional background and competency, this is where we put privacy in the context of all of those stakeholders, all of those professionals to try to achieve kind of that common objective of protecting the patient's rights, the user's rights, because it's the right thing to do, but also from a risk perspective, you're trying to make sure that your brand identity can be associated with that and really trying to achieve what everybody wants, including the organizations that are producing these products. So just making sure privacy is at that upper priority level with everything else.
Yes, and from my perspective, see it as a number of bolts all going into different directions. How do we get alignment to all be rowing in the same direction to support each other in a broader, more holistic goal? So to answer your question, Josh, how do we escalate privacy's privilege? For me, it's all about connecting the dots for people, gaining alignment around common goals and objectives for privacy, for the customer, and for the org.
And I'd say, emphasizing the diversity of stakeholders within the organization, but also between organizations involved in such a complex global, creation, deployment of such a system or product or service is just so critical. So diversity of stakeholders over quantity of stakeholders will lead to exponentially more novel, fresh, new, innovative ideas. It just does. And from a human perspective, the process was fun, but it was also safe. So we could allow people to think about things that they're not experts in, and oftentimes that childlike mind allows us to become unchanged from that authoritative lenses that we've had to adopt professionally, so that we can think differently. And we all have such creative potential. I feel it's always untapped. And so having the safe environment of allowing people to dip their toes into lanes or professions without, much risk.
Thank you, Jody. And so we're out of time today, but I'd like to really quick cover how people can participate in our research going forward. So this initially started as a DevSecOps initiative, and what we're doing now is switching this into a privacy by design and default working group. So on the Cloud Security Alliance website, you can go ahead and find it under the working groups list and join us there. And we'll be exploring both these workshops in further detail, but also any other related research when it comes to privacy by design and default. So thank you, everybody, and really appreciate our panelists today for making the time, and take care.